Good afternoon, everybody. It is so good to see you at the Winter Park Library. My name is Dr. Carl Kreisman. I am the Assistant Dean for History on for the college. My office is at the Winter Park campus. As you can see, I have my colleague, Dr. Heather Bryson, on our title slide. Dr. Bryson is a dear friend who I've taught with for now almost 10 years, I believe. And those of you who've been here before, this series that we do here at the library, I have the privilege of kind of managing it, and I try to bring as often as possible my friends who are experts in the fields, and I try to stay very far away from moments when I'm speaking in something that I'm not an expert in the field at, that I don't feel confident in the stuff. And Dr. Bryson is someone who's spent her career mostly in modern American history, focusing on women's history, a kind of a broad topic. And she was scheduled to be here. Her mother is in the hospital, and so she contacted me at the last minute, not too far last minute, but last minute enough that we couldn't make a switch from a sense of the scheduling. And I said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, if you send me your slides and you can send me your notes, I can try to wing it and go through the process. So much of what you're going to hear today is the material that Dr. Bryson had prepared. It will not be obviously delivered in her own style, because we do present it slightly differently. But the journey of the story that we're going to walk our way through is from her. She sends her sadnesses that she can't be here, but as Mother's Day is tomorrow, we were texting this morning, just kind of checking in on each other, and I said, you are where you need to be as a dutiful child, and then obviously she's also a daughter and a mother, so it's very important for her to be there with her mother. So I hope you will extend her your grace for her not being here. We look forward to having Dr. Bryson come when she can come to present here for us, and then hopefully you'll extend me your grace, because while there are some parts of this that I'm going to get to introduce you to a couple of my really close friends in the story, it is not my area of expertise. So you'll have to just forgive me for not being, this is not my wheelhouse. But we have had the privilege of working here at the library, or I have, since 2017. And over the past, this post-COVID, we've had an ongoing monthly process where we do different talks. And as we headed into this year, the thing we wanted to do was to spend our time spending the entire year looking at the semi-quincentennial. Because while we will celebrate, of course, on July 4th, it's technically not accurate to say that's our birthday or that's our day of somehow celebration, because by December 31st, we still did not have a country. We were still in the midst of trying to work our way out from the struggle. So we scheduled the entire year where we could to kind of match up to events that are historically connected. So in August, Professor Salma will be back to look at the August campaigns that Washington undertook in New York City. In January, one of my friends, Professor Zeno, was here, I'll get around in a minute, to present on Thomas Paine and common sense. So kind of tying it into the actual 250th moment of that. In July, we will spend time, hopefully you'll come back, looking at the Declaration. We're going to read the Declaration line by line. I have a microphone. We're going to pass it by. We're going to read it and talk about it. I want all of you who would be here to read it. We want to hear the voices of the people kind of reading this Declaration and spend a time focusing on it. At other times, though, we wanted to kind of step back and look at either groups. So Professor Salma is going to come and do a session for us on slavery in the Revolution. We're looking at some of the key figures. So next month, we're going to be looking at Thomas Jefferson and his role in this time period. So asking Dr. Bryson to come and speak on women in the Revolution was really, really important to me for lots of different reasons. But I thought it was important. As you'll see, much of what we're sharing today, and I'm going to keep saying we're sharing, is centered on the central fact that women are a vital part of our global history, and certainly for this nation in specific, there are many. In fact, there's so many that this presentation will not do them justice. There's nothing on there about the Schuyler sisters, which I was just told. There's a new study that was just a new book that was just released on them. There are so many more, as there are for all the different categories you can think of. We know George Washington. There were a lot of other generals who participated in military officers. They don't usually get books written about them, and they're not usually thought of in the story, particularly at kind of a survey level as we kind of work our way through casually. So there's so many more people that we can focus on. But we're going to kind of do our best and dive in. And we're going to start with one of my favorite people who we will come back to. So it's going to be really quick on her. We're going to come all the way back. This is where Heather wanted us to start. And that is looking at probably the most famous quote by any woman of the Revolutionary period. Abigail Adams, in a letter to her husband John, who was in Philadelphia when she wrote this. This is before the Declaration is actually put out. And she says very famously, "Remember the ladies." So the point of this, we will spend, I promise, more time on this. So we're going to come back and dig in a little deeper. What was Abigail thinking? What did John think? What were they trying to get to? But the point of this is those first three words. Remember the ladies. And so we're saying in this, while we wanted to have a specific session that we focused on women in the Revolution, is to say we need to remember the ladies. We need to bring them into the historical story. And sometimes it's worthwhile to us to say, well, why is it that we have to sort of emphasize it? Why isn't it just the natural part of how we teach our history? Well, some of that is because it's just not something that is brought up. So Professor Carol Berkins says, I love this quote, that when you look for women in the historical record, not just the United States, globally, they are, as she said, women bobbed on a sea of testosterone-driven history like shards of wood from sunken ships. It's a great quote, isn't it? Carol's got a wonderful way. She's a wonderful historian. If you ever get a chance to see her or read any of her work, I highly recommend it to you. And so we say to ourselves, why do we need to have a focus? Why isn't it just sort of natural? Or to say it the other way is, why is it when we look at the history of any people throughout any time period, why is it almost exclusively men? There's some part of that I think it's fair to say. You've all heard the old adage, that history is written by the victors. So that is always true. It's also true to say that history is written to shape the story, right? So particularly when it's written at the time, there's a sense of shaping the story, kind of managing how you want it. It could be that it's propaganda, so then we really know it's misshapen. Don't think that's always fair, but I do think it's sort of shaping the story. And fortunately or unfortunately, most peoples, all races, all ethnicities, all the continents, found it best for them to put forward the men who did things in their story and thus to minimize everybody else, including the women. This is why as historians, when we hear of somebody from the historical record who, a woman is mentioned in the record, we recognize that she's not just there as a pretty face. She had to have been a major significant figure because it is so at odds with the normal way of history's presentation. And again, all peoples, all continents, all time periods, when you read their histories, it is often the men that are put forward for us. There's another aspect, though, when you look specifically perhaps at the who writes the history. So this is kind of an important aspect, right? Because history is written. Certainly each of us could write diaries. We're going to have text. The future historians are going to look through all of our things, and some of you may do a better job of recording your thoughts in different places. So there's that, right? But at the same time, you can imagine in 2126, there will be a historian, hopefully a woman, who will be saying, let's write this history of this moment, maybe of the city of Winter Park, maybe of an educational institution like Valencia College, maybe of Florida, right? Then they all have the difficult task of deciding what to put forward and what to leave out, because there will be a lot that is left out. That's just kind of the way it is. When we teach in our classes, even if we weren't at the survey level, but particularly at the survey level, as I tell my professors, you're flying at like 35,000 feet. And you can say, look, there's a river. Look, over there's some mountains. See those twinkly lights? That's New York City. And we pass on by. You don't have time to get deeper, into the story as you're kind of working your way through. But there's also, particularly when you look at early U.S. history or U.S. history up into the late 20th century, women were just not included in education. Ergo, they would not be the historians who are being asked by schools or by places to write the history of this thing. Now, that's not to say they didn't do it. They did do it, as I'm about to show you. But this is an important aspect when you think about like our national story. It is this feeling of the fact that the women were not afforded the opportunity to go to school, even in New England, which would have been the leading, so you go back to the 1600s, they would have been the leading place for education and education for their daughters. But when you think about what we consider school, so obviously like Harvard, Yale, they were not including women. They were not wanting women to show up in that period of time. And then something happened in the educational world mid-19th century, and that is that we began to borrow things from Germany. And so when we borrowed some educational things from Germany, kindergarten being one of those, but the idea of a graduate school, have you not all heard when you hear somebody going to school and you realize they were finishing college at 18, some of us who labored through college are jealous. Like, well, I wish I could have gone to college at 18 and gotten it over with, right? And we've kind of elongated that. There wasn't like high school, there wasn't 10th, 11th grade. Those are all things that have been added in the 20th century for us, so that you're thinking about being, I want to be a professor, well, you have to have a graduate degree. Well, you're probably going to be 23, 24, 25 before you finish that. And you hear James Madison was done at 17. It's not that he is smarter than you. He might be smarter than you or me, but it's not naturally that he is. They got to start earlier, right? But in that process, women were not included. In bringing over from the concept to graduate school, and then who becomes the historians, who gets to write the history professionally, it was only men. Now, we could take that, and I don't think Heather would take it this way, to say then in a purely sexist or discriminatory way, they intentionally excluded women. Probably was some of that. But there's also this idea of subconsciously leaning into the kind of common way of thinking. We need to lift up our heroes, and of course it's only the men. No, they make me the heroes, right? That's obviously biased and missing, which is why after World War II, it is good that we see finally, and it's taken us way too long. As a father of 3 daughters, I can tell you this. I know it's taken way too long, right, for us to get to a place where we have basically made education something that you can go into any field. And we encourage our daughters and our sons and everybody else to go into whatever field that you may wish to go into. So that's one reason why. Now, it is important to note that it's not like everybody was blind to this fact. So I point out to you Benjamin Rush, and I promise that this will be like the only real focus of any male in the whole kind of talk. But Benjamin Rush sort of stands out. Several of the key founders, you all know Jefferson did Virginia and Franklin's role in education in Pennsylvania, but really Benjamin Rush is perhaps the leading revolutionary individual, male, who was thinking, we need to have, one, primary education for everybody, and we need to have it for women. So in 1787 in Philadelphia, he didn't start this, but the Young Ladies Academy was open, and before long they had women coming from all 13 states. I don't think it's fair to say this was the first post-secondary school for women, but it's probably one of the very first to kind of think in those terms of, in a sense, matching what the men were having afforded to them at, say, Princetown or in Yale, in those kind of places, or College of William and Mary. And so the women of Philadelphia, knowing Rush, because the year before, it's not on this slide, here it is, 1786, he had been the first person to really advocate for what we would call public education system. And in his advocation for the state of Pennsylvania should produce education for all of their children, so under, not just the elite, he was intentional saying that meant for the ladies, that meant for our daughters. So he was an oddball in that regard. His friends kind of looked at him like, I'm not so sure. So the people who started the Young Ladies Academy asked him to give a lecture, because they would sell tickets, unlike today where the libraries like just come for free. Imagine you had to pay $20 to be here, and then all that money was going to go to some charitable foundation. So that's what they did, and Rush was very popular at this point, and he knew he would draw a large crowd. So he gives this lecture, Thoughts on Female Education. And so what he's really trying to argue is that we can't build the republic that we hope to build without the other half of the population. We have to have the full population. And here he's leaning into the views that people like Adams and Washington and many, many others believed, that education was vital to sustaining the government they were looking to build. So again, let's not give it a name just yet, but in their minds, they're thinking of a government of the people. And if it's of the people, then we need all of the people to be educated in that way. And you can see that he's arguing that they should include things like law, science, and government. I promise it's the only picture of a male in the whole slide section, but you can see what he says in his speech. He urges the women in their brilliance. He's like, I believe you have this intellectual capacity. Ergo, you need to correct the mistakes and practices of our sex, meaning us men, by showing what? The cultivation of reason in women, and that it is a supreme, necessary, and natural thing. And you can see he was not saying teach them how to sew, teach them how to cook, teach them basic reading and writing. No, he believed it would be an equal academic structure for the women. So people like Rush, people who are kind of pushing out there, are helping us make the direction go. And I think part of what they're seeing and how this can expand this educational premise is vital for us is the fact that even without the PhDs and even without the publishers behind them, you have several women who are on the forefront of writing and publishing. We're going to come back and talk at length about Mercy and her writings. Elizabeth Elliot, who this lady is here, here in the 1840s, is writing her own book of history. So there are women who are writing and who are putting forward their information. So that's going to help in the process. But all that leads us to say, we come back then to say, why do we want to focus on women in the Revolution? Well, because they are half of the people who are here. When you go back to the beginning, kind of walk your way towards 1776, what you find out is that there is obviously, perhaps, maybe not obvious, half of the population are women. And so then when we think about the revolution occurring, in whatever capacity you think about the revolution occurring, it's women who are participating, and perhaps we might even say arguably at the forefront. And we're going to kind of see if we can make that argument as we go. And whether we're talking about the enslaved peoples, whether we're talking about the unenslaved, the white population that is in the 13 colonies, half are women. So we can't talk adequately or accurately about the revolution without pausing to say what's happening for the women who, as in many cases with other wars, are sustaining us. In fact, when you look at some cities, like say Boston, Philadelphia, post-French and Indian War, or in some of the cities where the main industries involved men being away from the home for a prolonged period of time, particularly involving shipping, right? Or off doing lumberjacking, right? Then who's running the city? Right? Who is the principal number of people in the city? Well, it's the female citizens who are responsible for that. And so that's kind of a vital aspect that we kind of see carrying us forward, and again, trying to make the case of why should we spend time talking about women in the revolution. Now, last month, if you were here, we looked at the road to the revolution, kind of like why did we get to the revolution? Well, you can't really adequately cover that without understanding that women were at the forefront. In fact, some historians will argue that there might not have been a revolution without the women. Now, the reason they're making this argument is because, as we've stressed in last month, and you may have heard in other places, there's an economic component to kind of what goes forward in the story. Like, how do we get from 63, when we're all celebrating the end of the French and Indian War, yay, we won, to 76, where we're mad and we want to revolt and kind of do our own thing. How do we get there, right? So that road to the revolution involves various and sundry points, but in short order, you could say it involves the idea that the government was trying to do a variety of things to impose its direction on its citizens, which, by the way, many of its citizens were happy with those things. But as you know, of course, whether it's with the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, the focus on tea, various places along the way, one of the ongoing ways of opposing that was to use economic pressure. And the economic pressure that was used to oppose came from not buying anything England brought over. They called that non-importation. We would call it a boycott, but they saw it as non-importation. So when you think about we're going to not buy anything, who's at the forefront of doing that? The moms. The moms are the ones who are doing the shopping. The moms are the ones who are in the kitchen. The moms are the ones who are providing for the children and the husband from a sense of food. The moms are, in many cases, as many moms are in the modern 21st century, the principal economic officer of the entity called that family. They do the shopping, they do the buying, they do the preparing. And so when they go into this non-importation thing, what's happening is women are at the forefront of this in trying to say, how do we replace the goods that we wanted to get? It's vital for us to understand in a day of great excess, and we just buy whatever we want from Amazon, and we kind of snap our fingers and bring that to me today, bring it this afternoon. I can't get it in 1 hour. They're looking at things that they need that day to eat and live that day, or for the clothing, the only piece of clothing they're going to have for a prolonged period of time. So then, if they don't buy it, for us a better example, instead of thinking of importation, would be if we decided we're never shopping at any of the local grocery stores ever again, because we're mad about something about grocery stores. Just put that in your head for a second, right? Now, where are you going to get the food you need for the next week? So you have to think about, okay, how am I replacing that? And you decide, I am never buying any piece of clothing from Target, Walmart, Amazon, because I'm mad about this thing. So you begin to boycott, right? And you sort of have to forget you're an American, because most of us have about 6 weeks of clothing we could wear, never replace, never repeat an item, except maybe for undergarments. But if you forget that for a second, when my clothes I have now wear out, what will I get to replace them? Because we're not buying from these people ever again. Does that make sense? Can you kind of get that in your head? Right? So one of the things that they decided to do, which makes a lot of sense, but we would probably struggle, is they're going to make their own clothes. And they really use the phrase homespun, spun obviously connecting to spinning wheel, not just for the clothing, but they use it almost as kind of a code word for homemade, made in America, right? Which today we might go, yes, we should be getting more things made in America. Don't think like that. Think in terms of, again, you needing to make everything yourself. I don't know about you, I got no chance making shoes. In fact, I can't make anything like this. I could grow flowers. I'd be good at the flower growing part. But besides that, if you don't want to trade me a bouquet for the shirt that you can make, I'm in trouble, right? So a lot of us would be that way because of the kind of culture that we live in now. It's not a good or bad, it's just saying a reality kind of a thing. And so, they went and said, we can replace things. They replaced their tea with rum. Don't get excited thinking, oh, rum's of course a lot better than tea. It wasn't really in that sense. It was that this was a homemade drink we could make to replace the drink we prefer. And of course, nobody's drinking water, so it's not like it's heavily alcoholic or anything like that. You would drink, don't listen to Captain Jack from Pirates of the Caribbean, who drunk all the rum like it's alcohol. I mean, there's a little bit, sure, but that's not kind of the point in the process. And you can see this as they begin to report in their papers how the women were making these claims and these stances to say, we will not buy these things. So again, it's one thing for the men to say, we will not import. They're not actually going to be involved in this. It was more important for the women to say, we will, yes, not import. And so you can see they put themselves in the paper, and the paper notes these things that, that they hadn't worn ribbons, which maybe some of you are like, I'm not wearing a ribbon ever, but that was something that was a normally worn thing, and you didn't have ribbon in America. So it was something that was only brought over from England, the process, right? And spinning, this is one of the interesting things. Professor Birkin makes sure to note that spinning is not an enjoyable thing. In fact, I'll go forward and come back. Here's this picture. They're all smiling. They all look very happy. Nobody was happy doing spinning. In fact, Professor Birkin makes the point that many women were glad that they had a daughter because then they could assign her the task of spinning because it was mindless. It was, think of what we hear in the early 20th century of people working in factories and the numbingness of working at a factory line. That's what spinning was. So this is not like, yay, the women were so excited to be patriotic. They were patriotic because they were willing to do a mind-numbing, kind of grudging type of thing, but they did it for a purpose. And I want to go back to here. You can see, for instance, the Quincy family we're going to mention in brief a couple minutes later down the road, but they're one of the richest families in the Boston area, right? So Dolly Quincy becomes the person who will later marry John Hancock, and there's some places where they're going to parties and gatherings, and she made sure she did not wear the prettiest outfits that she had because those had come from England in a prior time, but she wore the things even though she didn't like the fact that she had to do that. And John, who was interested in Dolly at this point, was like, okay, I can do the same thing. And when you're the richest person, you probably can get away with still having quote-unquote nicer clothes. And so they were focused on doing this, and you can see they would gather in large groups. So this is one of the important points of noting what the spinning and the homespun ties into, because the women would be in large groups having community together. Now that's not as odd as it is for us. When we get a large group together these days, it's kind of along the little weird side kind of thing. And how many times you get a party invitation, you're like, I'm not going to that. Other people will be there. And so there's that kind of, but they still had this moment. And what's happening at this moment is the women were engaged in deep conversations about what was happening in this process of developing the road to the revolution. Like, why should we do this? What is happening? And notice what they're not doing is simply saying, well, what does my husband say, ergo the end? But these are women in their autonomy and their agency having these conversations with depth, digging in, thinking, disagreeing with each other. I remind you of something I've said here many times. When you look at the American Revolution, it's a split crowd. You know, there's at least probably 20% who are still vastly loyal to their government. There's a 20% that's vastly angry at their government and ready, therefore, to leave. And there's that middle 40, 50, 60% who aren't sure, but some lean to the revolutionary side and some lean to the loyalist side. So you'd have these moments in the 60s going into the early 70s when it wasn't clear we were actually going to do some revolution, but you would still have a moment where we've decided we're going to do non-importation. And so maybe your family is kind of moderate loyal. You don't really want to do it, but you also don't want to get the derision from your neighbors. So you kind of go along with it. And maybe teaching my daughter to spin her own clothes is still a good idea anyway. So you kind of make that pathway. But you're there in this conversation with upwards, in some cases, to 100 women, right, in a large room spinning, both for themselves and for the community. And somebody be like, oh, you know, the decision is so terrible. And somebody else, well, I don't think it's quite so terrible. And so they're having these intellectual, with depth, political conversations with one another as to what is happening in the process. And then they would begin to use this idea of homemade as kind of a badge of honor in the process. And so, you know, here's one of the things that's important kind of on the journey that I was just saying to you is noting how the reporting of the time is acknowledging the agency or the individual decision-making of the women. So you kind of can see this when you see, for instance, these brides saying they're not going to marry their fiancé if they buy the wedding license having paid the stamp. You remember the stamp tax was basically a sense in which anything done with paper, ergo a wedding license, would have to pay a small tax. And so these revolutionary women are saying, nope, we're not going to do that, using pressure on their fiancés. And notice here in the Boston Gazette, they talked about how they were doing this on the group I'd mentioned before, on their own free will and accord. Like the ladies thought it was important to make sure that the paper was reporting this, that they weren't there simply because their husband made them do it, but that they too were deciding that they wanted to join in that journey. When the revolution begins and the war comes along with it, the women were equally involved in this process. So this is not true just for the Revolutionary War, but you see this often. But during the Revolutionary War, as the armies begin to build, the women were there. Some of them were there because they were mothers, some were there because they were wives, some were there because they were sisters, and they wanted to be involved. Some of them felt like it was no place else for them to be. Some of them wanted to try to help their loved one who was there. Now Washington, probably like every other general, would in one sense prefer nobody be here who's not part of the fighting army, both for distraction sense, you're going to distract us, and then also from a sense of now we have to protect you, and that might be complicated. But he himself acknowledged and recognized the ladies being there were beneficial to us. And these armies would show up, and wherever they would go, they'd be like little cities and kind of moving through the process. And it would turn out, when we talk about military wars, if you ever do a study on the wars, you'll notice when you read these books or you go to a study about it, it's like, on this day was this battle. And then 6 months later, on this day was this battle. And the talk that's presented is that battle, and then this battle, and then that battle. But one of the things you have to remind yourself when you're reading and things do that is that was a real 6 months. What did they do for the 6 months? So they're living, they're existing. Sometimes they're on the move, sometimes they're in hiding, but it's a normal 6 months. So when we study military history, we do often kind of see these high point marks that we know the names of these battles, but we forget the long period of time in between. And it's important for us as we're learning and studying history to think that's a normal 24-hour day. So then imagine then you fought a battle and then you've got this 6 month window of time, and that's between the two battles. What's going on? You're spending time living. You're basically being like a city. Well, now, who's doing all that? Now, certainly the men could do it, but most of the time they wouldn't know how to do it, right? And so the women were there and formed and performed a vital aspect of keeping the army sustained, both from an eating point of view, a cleaning point of view, a healthcare point of view. I mean, they did chopping the wood, burying the dead. Washington and others would note that in some senses, because we had mothers and daughters and sisters and wives there, the army was healthier. And even though Washington was unhappy with having them around all the time, he recognized that they helped him deal with the issue of desertion. In Washington's Revolutionary Army, throughout the 6 years of battle, that's going 75 to 81, there's a consistent concern for Washington and other generals of how the people who had signed up, most of them by their free will, were only there for a short period of time. And not so shocking to any of us, battles are horrible, right? And they're terrifying. And so somebody might sign up with lots of bravado and I'm ready to go. And then often was the case, this is throughout history, the first time there's a real battle, they're actually the smart one to go, this is a terrible place for me to be. And they want to get away, right? And then, there's all that questions of training and elan and sticking with your team and all that kind of stuff. Washington was like, having the women there was beneficial. It kind of helped in the process. It kind of preserved. And he knew that from experience because his own wife came and took care of him often. And so Martha being there with him, particularly during the winter months, when back in that time, the winter months armies would really shut down. There'd be very little actual battle going on. He's got Martha with him. So he, even though would complain about like all these camp followers, all these people, and there were often children there as well, he realized they were performing a vital function from functional things to do to psychological impetus and vital kind of pulling off the battles. But they didn't just hang on, they actually fought. Many times we have multiple stories of women engaging in battle, most of whom go down in history nameless to us. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, I know the famous name, Molly Pitcher. Well, Molly Pitcher is not an actual person. She is an amalgamation of several moments in several battles during the Revolutionary War where a wife or a mother or a woman was there, and either because she realized she had to or because she wanted to, she participated, particularly at the level of the artillery. So I'm sure you've seen enough movies to understand the soldiers who are fighting, who are walking and fighting, the infantry, they're all out there in the front. Then there's the guys who get to ride on the horse, and so they're riding around and they're going around the edges and stuff. And then sort of in the back, not hiding, but in the back, they're the guys with the cannon. So they're kind of standing there. So it was more natural for if you wanted to help, you could help in the process. And some of you may have gone to St. Augustine or gone to Williamsburg and seen people the firing of cannons. And so there's an aspect of where you at least need to cool off the cannon. And so there's ways they would do that with swabbing it with water, but also sometimes just using a pitcher of water, pouring it on the barrel so that it wouldn't blow up in the process. So Molly was a common name that would be used for someone with an M-sounding name, and pitcher meant bring the pitcher of water. All right? This picture here is the first one that we know from Dennis Malone Carter in 1854. And in one sense, though it is supposed to represent Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, Mary, Molly, we don't actually think that this is her. All right, that's part of the story. Historians have kind of gone back and around about this. But in one sense, it's better for you and me to see her not as Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, but as every woman. The women were that involved in battle. We just simply cannot have an accurate number, maybe up into the thousands, of women who fought and participated in some way during the time of battle, being wounded in some cases, some being killed. But what of this painting? Well, this painting becomes one of the most famous paintings. So the Currier and Ives painting, if you remember on the book, the slide that I showed you earlier, was made for the centennial. For the semi-quincentennial, 250, centennial, 1876. They made it for this. You'll notice there's a familiarity. There's the woman who's doing something. Here's the other one. Here she's sort of not with the cannon, but she's got a flag. There's these dudes doing all this kind of stuff. Often here, and here. There's a wounded person who plays the role of a wounded, theoretically, her husband. That's the story that we're given. We're given that story not just made up. So, where's the name of one? Joseph Plum Martin was a young man who fought in the army who kept a very good diary. So at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, he reports that there was a man manning a cannon who was shot and killed, and that it was his wife who then came and did the Molly Pitcher action. But more than just the picture, she picked up the stuff to begin loading the cannon. Like she knew enough from having watched to know here's what needs to happen, right? He never names who it is in the story. Now, we believe that Mary and her husband were there, so it kind of seems to fit, but we don't have a primary source or a first-person witness to say it is actually the Molly Pitcher of the story of Monmouth is actually Mary. There is another eyewitness account, but again, that same person did not use any name. It's like, yep, there was a cannon, dude got killed, girl picked up the thing, we kept firing the cannon because she was there. Yay, she saved the day. Who is that person? No idea. But it kind of went down, and you can see when her own son dies in 1856, the paper's obituary went with the story. So it's possible that she is the official Molly Pitcher backing up of all these pictures. If that's her, we could say that. But we don't know for sure. Because it could actually be that the more famous Molly Pitcher is this Mary Corbin. Mary Corbin was another lady who, again, with the Army, as we've talked about before, also in a battle. This was in New York before Monmouth, as Washington and the Army are fleeing Manhattan in a series of beatdowns by the British Army all the way down to the Delaware River. And at one time, again, wounded husband takes up the work, begins the battle. She was actually captured because she was wounded in the battle, and she was captured by the British. British doctors saved her life. She lost use of her left arm, and then basically ended up over time in West Point with basically we could say PTSD, which, not surprising, I think I would have PTSD if I was in a military service in a battle. She eventually, as you can see in 79, will be given a lifelong pension, but she also kind of ends up in this kind of infamous kind of way of being this beggar, vagabond woman who just sort of exists around West Point until the DAR saved the day for her after she died, noting what she had done, kind of highlighting her involvement, and eventually, as you can see, getting her interred with military honors at West Point. Now, she's not the only one. You may have known this name here, Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson took the name of her dead brother, Robert Shirtliff, and volunteered to fight. Professor Birkin says that the first time she just went to sign up to get money, because when you signed up, you would get a bonus, and then if you deserted, you could leave with your money. And then she did it another time. And there are many, many famous men who did this, in some sense, in not a noble kind of way. The second time she went back, she chose to stay. So the first time it seems like she was doing this just because she was financially in trouble, thought it could work out, pulls it off, goes away. But the second time she seems desiring to actually participate and fight, and she will. She'll stay in the Army, she'll fight. She's actually wounded in one battle, shot in her arm and her leg, and then also I think her head was wounded. She let the doctor work on her head, but then kind of brushed him off about doing anything else. He goes off to deal with some other people, and she snuck out of the tent, tended to herself, got her own knife and dug out the bullet out of her arm because she did not want to be discovered for this case. Eventually, she came down with camp fever, so became a little delirious, and in that moment, the doctor undressed her, discovered, and like, oh, shoot, what's this about? And so then she was exposed, both literally and kind of to the point. But she had made such a great impression. You can see some of our rock star names, Revere, Knox, were among the many who are like, this person deserves to be honored. She's actually fighting and helping us in the process. And she will ultimately get what many of these women who are anonymous to us never got, a veteran's pension. And in fact, as you can see, she was so highly regarded that when she died before her husband petitioned the Army for the widow, would be for him a widower, but for the widow's pension, and he got it. He didn't get it because he was important, he got it because the Army, when she had passed, recognized the value that Deborah had played in the story. We have a whole other lane, which again, we're going to later this year, one of our kind of group topics, Professor Salma's doing this one, is we're going to be looking at the question of slavery in the Revolution and its role for the African American community, right? So this is just a little briefer here, but there are many instances of African American women who participated and who kind of play a vital story in kind of carrying the war forward. And this again is from a military point of view, from a warring point of view. And you have some of the different ladies up here who fought and who participated. So here, Hannah Till, her husband Isaac, they were part of Washington's military household. Again, this idea of Washington recognizing that he himself is benefiting from the fact that there are women in and around his camp followers. He knew he couldn't be too angry or ugly about the process. So all these women will participate. Obviously, the question of African Americans and slavery is one of the most important ones to focus on because of the challenge that it raises for people like a Jefferson who are talking in these flowing and glowing terms about freedom and liberty and how the Americans, particularly, well, including the leaders of the South, making this consistent argument about what's happening to us from the British is we're losing our liberty, and because we're losing our liberty, we should fight for our freedom when they're obviously slaveholders. And so it's kind of like the hypocrisy of that kind of gets to us. And so it is worth noting Elizabeth Freeman as an example of how the slavery does play a role in the story. She was an enslaved person. Remember, slavery was alive in all 13 colonies. There are multiple people who had slaves in all of the 13 colonies. The numbers were larger the further south you went because of the idea of kind of agribusiness and the larger plantations, but it still existed all the way in the process. There's a whole interesting debate, which we don't need to get into here. I think Mike will probably bring it up when he talks about how the slavery piece in the African American community were held up by the British and then later by the Americans as sort of a bargaining chip or threatening motif. Governor Dunmore, Lord Dunmore of Virginia, is the one who most famously, as you can see there, declares, we'll give freedom to anybody who fights for the government. That's for us, the government side of things. And of course, he first made a threatening move in that direction, hoping to move off the middle of the Virginians, because most Virginians were not interested in revolution early. They were frustrated with taxes. They didn't want revolution, right? And so he thought, I will threaten to take their slaves away so they'll all come running to our side. He completely misjudges, and in making that threat, pushed more of the moderates into the Patrick Henry camp of we need revolution, we need it now, kind of thing. So Elizabeth, whose name before she gained her freedom, and I can't make this up, I mean, this is just what's in the historical record, so don't ask me to explain why someone would have what seems to be an unfavorable name, but Mom Bet was what she was called. And she was sold into slavery into Massachusetts, right? So again, just making the point, this is not in the South. The person she was sold into slavery with, this guy, Colonel Ashley, and this guy, Theodore Sedgwick, they actually worked to create a series of documents that highlighted the aspect of sort of all men are created equal, everybody deserves their freedom, kind of motif that comes from the Declaration, in which by this point, Massachusetts had put in their constitution. So when John Adams comes back from Europe the first time, and he basically single-handedly writes the Massachusetts Constitution, they did not focus and say anything about manumission or the freeing of the slaves at that moment, but the entire thread through the document is one that is embracing this idea that we would say individual liberty, right? So then when Ashley and Sedgwick are making this document that they're going to try to highlight the fact during the war that this idea exists of a sense of freedom for everybody, what we believe happening is that Elizabeth was in the house, would be working around them and listening. And like many, she was a very intelligent woman. And she began to hear them talk about, individuals and freedom. She's like, I think I'm an individual. I think freedom might apply to me. So she then secretly goes to Sedgwick, who she perceived as the non-slave holder might be more open-minded to her request. And she asked him to become her lawyer in appealing for her freedom in Massachusetts. So he does. Not surprisingly, Colonel Ashley, not happy about this. So the two friends sort of got at each other a little bit, and they were in court at odds with each other. The long story short is that Sedgwick wins. He successfully wins the case. Ashley what's the word I just lost the word. Yeah, goes up he what's the word I'm talking about? Thank you, Jared. He appeals. And he goes up and he loses again. And he was going to appeal to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and then either he recognized the handwriting was on the wall against him, or he had some friends tell him, you're looking bad, dude. We're not going to do slavery in this state. Regardless, he dropped the appeal, went with the Supreme Court. And Elizabeth was free and could take the name, which she did, of Elizabeth Freeman, and kind of live out her life in the process. And she will. And she'll stay friendly with the Sedgwick family for the rest of her life in the process. What about spies? If you like the James Bond story, the American Revolution is a great one for you to get involved with. There's a whole kind of deep story about the spy network, and perhaps not surprisingly, women were often at the forefront of this. So here's just a few names of the women who risked their lives for the revolution, or in the case of Mrs. Bates, to defend the government. I will again remind you, for those of you who have not been here before, the American Revolution is at best understood as a civil war. So the British citizens in North America are fighting against the British citizens in North America. The British citizens in North America who think the government's not doing enough, versus the British citizens in North America who believe that, hey, we're citizens of the most progressive government in the world, which they were, so why would I want to give that up? So, you know, the Mrs. Bates is up here, along with many others. There were women who fought with the Loyalist armies as well as with the Continental armies in the process. Mrs. Darr, perhaps, is the most famous. She had this great little thing they call the button code. And she would use it with her son, who she would dress, and then have a series of how she would button his clothing and his jacket. That was a code that then he would go scampering off to meet his brother, not with anything written down or anything, but his brother knew the code and could figure out what he was being passed along in the story. Mrs. Strong used the clothesline code. She had a whole series of things she would do with putting clothes on the clothesline and where she would put the pins. And the pins were in certain spaces. And the other members of the Culpeper spy ring, including this lady who we'd never know her name, she's known as the lady. And they would, you know, they're doing spy stuff. You've seen enough spy shows, you know how they do this thing, all secretive and whatever. And so they would eventually come around and try to get her information, and they wouldn't talk to each other. They could just see the clothesline and go, oh, okay. And then run off with the information and that kind of stuff. Women deeply involved in the story. Perhaps the place they're most involved, not surprisingly, is on the home front. When the revolution begins, as we already kind of laid out with the Homes Fund, and then moving its way through the time of the battles between 75 and 81, there's a home front concept. When you do any good study of any of the wars that nations and people go through in the United States or elsewhere, it should take an effective time to talk about what's happening on the home front. And so you have women such as DeBerrit Reed deciding, we need to try to fund this thing. Washington was consistently talking about how he didn't have the funding. So they're in Philadelphia, they're raising money to try to support the army. Other times it would be more of a, from a sense of supporting the army, would be more of a coincidental, the army has come by, they would want to help out, they would give things to the army, they might have clothing that they've created, they might be willing to give away some of their food to try to help the army. It was always an ongoing battle of trying to keep the army fed. But the main thing was that with the sons and husbands away, the women ran everything. And so the Rosie the Riveter that we know of in World War II really existed back here. She just isn't got a riveter, because nobody's got a riveter, but she's doing the work. One of the things John Adams, and I'll show you this in a minute, thought highly about Abigail was that he knew he could trust her, he could trust the farm to her because of how brilliant she was and what a good businesswoman that she was. She was nobody's fool, and she could take care of things. And that happened throughout the 13 colonies in the process. It wasn't easy, though. If you know your Civil War in particular, you may remember there's multiple times where they talk about both North and South having food riots. But this idea of privation is something that happens a lot in the wars, right? Where all of a sudden there's just not enough food to go around. And so there were food riots as women would kind of lead the charge to try to say, we need to provide for our families, we need to provide for what's going on. And at times, they would riot. They would actively go after merchants, particularly in places like New York, where they might know that there was a loyalist leaning. So there could be supplies and manufacturers that were there, that were in the city, that were more likely to be loyalists. They'd go after them. Abigail talks about a riot in Boston in which over 100 women accosted a merchant who basically tried that male macho thing of like, you can't touch me. And they picked him up and just threw him into a wagon and threatened his life. And if you know anything about tar and feathering, you realize that if somebody's threatening your life, you might want to pay attention to that. And so they got the keys off of him, opened his warehouse, basically took as much stuff as they could find from his warehouse. So the women are, again, not looking for men to save them. They're working in concert with the men. As the men are fighting, the women are equally fighting and protecting. So that's kind of an overall summary. And for the rest of our time, what I want to focus on are three of my heroes in the story. Kind of three rock stars kind of making our way through. The first of these is Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley like Freeman, was also a slave, also in New England, this one in Boston. So again, getting your mind wrapped around slavery in all 13 colonies. She was kidnapped, as all the slaves were, brought over here as a young girl. She was 7 or 8, we're not totally sure. She was deemed sickly. She was weak, which basically meant that the family that bought her could buy her at a cheaper price. And to some degree, the idea that we get from the Wheatley family, so she takes their name, but John Wheatley, was that he bought her to basically be, plaything is not quite at it, to help the wife, but not, again, they think she's so sick, she's probably going to die. So it is sort of like a toy, it is sort of like a plaything, a companion, somebody who will be with the wife. Well, they quickly find out that Phillis is a quite brilliant young lady, as many slaves would have been, and brilliant in their mind and their capacity. And for whatever reason, Susanna and the 2 children participated in educating her, which was illegal to do, but they did it anyway, and taught her how to read and write. And they quickly found out that she was not only just a precocious mind, she had a skill to her in the realm of poetry. And so early on, at age 13, we're pretty certain about this, she writes her first poem. It's not one that you and I would necessarily focus on and read, but her claim to fame came 3 years later when she wrote an elegant poem on the death of that celebrated divine and eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the Reverend and learned George Whitefield. Whitefield died, and she wrote a long poem about it. It got sent into the person who was doing the eulogies at the time, and eventually it gets printed in London within a book celebrating Whitefield. He was that important. When it gets printed, this poem by this girl that nobody knows exactly who that is out there, and it was so good and so awe-inspiring that people were like, wait, well, who's this person? So then Susanna, the woman, wanted to further Phillis's opportunities by providing her a chance to publish her poetry. So they tried. They're unsuccessful at getting any economic support to do this in the United States or in the colonies. So she puts Phillis and her son on a boat to go to London because she has some friends in London, and she believes, due to the success of this poem, that they'd be willing to publish her other poems that would find them worthwhile. So they do. 1771, Nathaniel is the son, and the 2 of them sail off to London together. When they're there, they meet up with Selina Hastings, who's the Countess of Huntington, for whom Whitefield had been the chaplain. So she knew of the poem. So it's kind of like, you know the poem celebrating Whitefield? Oh yes, it's a life poem. Here's the author. Oh, so they have a meeting. They're there for about a year. Hastings is so impressed that she basically tells a publisher, Archibald Bell, you need to publish this. So he begins the process of getting the poems from Wheatley to publish for her. Now, while she's there, she becomes celebrated. And so she's kind of famous in the moment. You get a chance to meet various people, including, as you can see, Franklin, and could have chosen to stay because the book was going to be published. She could have been famous, could have stayed and lived her life there. But she had an emotional attachment to the Wheatley family, again, taking their name. And she knew that Susanna was ill. They found out while they were there she was more ill. And so, like Dr. Bryson today, going to be with her mom, Phillis Wheatley's like, okay, I'm going to go back. And there was never a contest or argument between her and Nathaniel about going back. She chose to go back on her own free will to the United States, where she would still be a slave in the process. She does. In 73 is when Bell publishes the book that Wheatley's known for, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. It is the first book of poetry published by an African-American woman, only the 3rd book published by a woman in the colonies at large, and it is explosively good. And so people are interested in it. It's so good that people believe it can't, either A, can't be a woman, or B, in particular, can't be an African-American woman. So in Boston, there was a moment when there was a big dispute. The Wheatleys are going, this is our girl, she did this. And there's people like, that can't be true. So she's in this meeting, as you can see here, where she's basically given an examination, sort of like a person getting their PhD and they have to go for oral defense, an oral examination. So she sits in the room and kind of talks her way through. And you can see it's a pretty heady group here. You've got Hancock, Oliver, I don't know Biles all that well, but Hutchinson. There's a few others in the room. They finish the examination. They're like, we are convinced this is her work. She's the one who wrote it. And so in the American version of the book, they wrote a foreword and they all signed it, which is interesting that in 73, you've got something that both Hutchinson and Hancock signed in collaboration, because by this point they hate each other. So it's kind of just interesting kind of point in the process. She does talk about the issue of slavery. She doesn't highlight it. In the 19th century, she often got criticized by people who were kind of in the post-Civil War but civil rights era, that she wasn't aggressive enough in support of slavery. But for her time and for her position, she actually was pretty much on the forefront, kind of making the argument. She's the first person to use the term Columbia to describe the United States. So most of you are like, Columbia, what do you get it? You know it, you just don't know you know it. Washington, District of, like, have you ever thought, what district, what? You know, so that's where that comes from. So the District of Columbia, the celebration of us as Columbia, goes back to Wheatley. Now, she's not the only person to kind of tie in this kind of analogous term of Columbia as just like this land of beauty and this land of God-focused kind of stuff. But she's the first one to use it in print. And she does it in a poem that she writes to and about George Washington that she gets to read to him. So it's kind of a wonderful thing to think, in some sense, when Washington City, as it was known, was built in honor of George Washington, taking land from Virginia, his home, and Maryland, they honored him, but by extension, they honored her by saying, here's the district, the capital of Columbia. Why would we use that term? You could say because of Phillis Wheatley. She's the reason we kind of got in the process. Her life doesn't end well, as it doesn't end well for many people. The Wheatley family, all of them pass on. Till they died, we could say that they served as her patron. And so they helped her, she lived there. There was no longer really a slave-friend relationship. She lived there after she was freed. There's no, though, eagerness amongst Americans. So it's almost like, so I was having this conversation today, when you think about publishing a book, so people ask me, when are you going to publish a book about your doctoral work? It's like that. Well, yes, some people can, particularly if you're famous like Carol Birkin, you can have an opportunity where publishers come to you, but most of the time it's not how it works, and they kind of want to know, what do you bring to the story? Well, back then what you would do is you would say, hey, I'm going to publish a book, how many of you will buy it, and will you put the $20 down now? So that's how you raised proof that you think, okay, I've sold 500, I'll make a print run of 1,000, thinking I can make it happen. And the publisher's like, all right, I think we can make this work. And they're willing to put their name on the line. Kind of, maybe you should go back. Maybe I should try that. Go back to that. Nobody was interested in Phyllis's book when she tried that. She eventually gets married to a named John Peters. Peters was himself not a great person and did not really go and do his fair share in kind of working, often didn't work, or when he get a job, couldn't keep a job. So really supporting the family, as this tragically has often happened to other women, fell to her shoulders. So she does her best in a variety of different ways. She writes poetry. We think she had published around 140, 150 poems, most of which that have been lost to us. Modern scholars have recovered different poems that they think, this one is hers, this one lies with her, kind of fits in the category that reads like Wheatley's poetry. So it's kind of a nice thing. It's tragic, though, that we don't have like a second book of poetry from this woman who really is, in one sense, like our first poet. She could almost be like America's first poet laureate if we'd had such a concept in the process. Mercy Otis Warren. So I mentioned to you earlier the Otis family. The Otis family is really, or arguably, the most important family. Now you can do a whole study, there's some really good books that do this, that focuses on how the connections in New England, outside of Boston, between a small set of families, including the Quincy family and the Otis family, really galvanized the American Revolution. And I don't think it's fair to push that too far and say they are the only reason there was a revolution. But it is You see a lot of the rock stars whose names you recognize in the story. So I just mentioned that to you because not only is Mercy brilliant in her own self, she's brought up in a family that was at the forefront of all the issues that are, congruent with the revolutionary journey itself. They're pushing and arguing for this sense of rights, whether it's fully fair or not. We've had that conversation somewhere else, but in her family, this was a big, big deal. And you can see that John Adams, who became her friend, was completely taken with her brilliance. One of the things that's true about Adams in his own assessment is that it almost always for him was, what was I finding in the mind? Was this person as sharp as I am, as thoughtful as I am, as smart about things? And he loved Mercy. They will tragically, towards the end, I'll show you, kind of part on some things, which I'll get to in a second. But it's kind of, incontestable instances of genius. She marries James Warren, and so Mercy Otis Warren. Again, the Otis family is really important. In 1761, her brother, that she called Jimmy, J-E-M-M-Y, James Otis, is the first to kind of push the issue relative to the power of the government compared to what was happening on the ground. Remember, the revolution at one level is only about control. Who's in charge? And what was happening up and down the seaboard, particularly in the cities, and particularly amongst the rich elite, was that they didn't like the fact that the government was now showing up saying, we're actually in charge, because they were like saying, no, we've been here, we think we should be in charge. So the Otises are one of the first ones to push before you even get through the French Indian War. Because normally, if you come to my class and you say, let's start the road to the revolution, we start after the war with the Proclamation Act of 1763. But in 1761, the Otises are pushing this issue in a battle. Now, it's not really the first time that they're having this battle. So their dad, James Otis Sr., was considered at the time probably the leading jurist in all of Boston. And there's a moment at which he is up for being appointed as the Massachusetts Supreme Justice, the Chief Justice of their Supreme Court, when politics intervenes with the name I already introduced to you, Thomas Hutchinson. So Hutchinson is a mover and a shaker and a player, and the story's going to move forward towards the revolution where Hutchinson becomes like the leading voice of loyalism and pushing back against the people like Sam Adams, John Hancock, who are fighting for the revolution. And so before 1761, the Supreme Court Chief Justice seat comes open. The Otises and most of their friends believed he was the rightful person. Hutchinson gets appointed to the position, and so for the rest of Mercy Otis Warren's life, she hates Thomas Hutchinson. All the Otis family and their friends, like John Adams, hated Thomas Hutchinson, mostly because of this in the process. So as the revolution goes along, Mercy Otis Warren becomes really the voice, or at least one of the key voices, particularly in New England, in trying to communicate a vision of what is happening without direct attack openly. Everything she publishes before 1790 is published anonymously, both because she was a woman and also because she didn't, want to get outed necessarily. A lot of the writings that we have from people that we now know who wrote it, at the time they just used some sort of synonym or some sort of like code word or code name for themselves, some of them quite weird and interesting in the process. So she writes these poems, The Adulterer, The Defeat, using names and code names, almost like kind of like Shakespeare, where there's different names of people that have like a characteristic name, and they're bringing out, and in both of these, she's basically skewering Hutchinson, who by this point is like the leading figure of the loyalist efforts in Boston. When the Boston Tea Party happens, John writes to her and says, you should write a poem about this. She initially demurs and goes, I don't think so. But then she did, as she wrote The Squabble of the Sea Nymphs, or The Sacrifice of Tuscaroras. In 74, she writes another, again, these are all anonymous, called The Group. And in The Group, she's one of the first who's openly saying, where we're headed will be armed conflict. So get ready, or back down. She's not on the back down side. She wants to push this. She was trying to actually warn the loyalists and the British government, don't push us, you're going to end up in a war and you're going to lose. So you should, kind of accommodate us. She wasn't warning anybody, on the Patriot side. She also, though, takes a moment in that play to kind of make a really strong feminist stance of saying, you know what, this probably wouldn't happen if women were in charge. Because it's men who are overly bellicose, who kind of have these visions of grandeur, of fighting and doing something great on a battlefield. And all you do is get us all into wars, and now she's thinking back to what I told you about the home front. And we'll be the ones left with us women holding the bag, suffering, because you men are out there being all testosterone driven, and that's going to be ruinous for the rest of us, kind of stuff. 1790, she does come up and publish eventually All in the Open, which we'll get to in a second. Now, along the way, she ends up in a setting, there's seats in the front if you want to come down. Along the way, she ends up in a setting where her husband's involved in the battle. So remember, Lexington and Concord happened, and then that leads to the besieging of Boston, which leads to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Remember, this is all before the Declaration itself is kind of written in the process, right? So along the way, she becomes someone who starts writing down all the events that are happening. Some of these are from diary moments, some of these are from her own memory, some of these are from things she's getting. So her husband's at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So he sends her a report. So she starts collecting this information. This will be really important for the stance that she comes, in which we could arguably say, I told you this earlier in the session, where she might be fairly called the first American historian, or certainly the first American historian writing about the Revolution. There were others who wrote before her book got published, which we'll show you when that happens. But I think it's fair to Mercy to say, yeah, she's probably the first one. She's certainly the first one who kind of goes in this mentality of thinking, I want to intentionally keep this for posterity. And so she's trying to find ways to keep it for posterity. How can she write? How can she keep up with it? And so when her husband starts writing her notes, she's like, I want to know more. And so she's asking questions. She's in Plymouth, so today by car you could get to Bunker Hill quickly. You can't get there quickly at that time. So she's counting on the writing of things. And she starts writing, because of her relationship with John Adams, she starts getting more information from John Adams as to what's happening in the political places where he's involved. So again, their friendship is deep enough that he's like writing her letters, she's writing him, he's writing her. And so there's parts where she just gets information because he tells her, and there's parts where he gets information where he begins to say, let me tell you what happened here. And she's like, what happened at this point? And then he's answering her, writing back in the whole process. It's interesting that you can see, I already hinted to you that she and John are going to split, or she and John and Abigail. So Abigail and her became very close friends. They're going to split. Where they split is on their own understanding about what does it mean, that what are we trying to build. Right, so we've covered this ground before. We're not going to get lost here this time. When we say republic, remember that's the vision of how they perceive things as it's designed. And so at one point, she and John are writing, and he asks her, well, what kind of government would you build? He's not being flippant. He's not being kind of dismissive, like you're a silly girl, tell me. This is somebody he deeply respects. And there are at this point where he's already thinking himself about how will he construct information about the governance. He's really the first one in Philadelphia, at least, to kind of write out what would a government based around the concept of a republic look like. It's not being done anywhere else in the world at that time, so they want to write it down. And she says, well, I want a republic, and don't think that's connected to our political terms, because it's not. So she means a government like a republic, if established in the genuine principles of equal liberty. We're going to come back to that in a minute. That's both equal in the sense of amongst the peoples, meaning there would not be hierarchy, which is what they're trying to work to get rid of, but also equal men and women. So there's this kind of aspect of wanting to say, John, just so you know, this is kind of the lane we're looking at. We want you to be thinking in these terms. Equal liberty, then, is what's going to ultimately begin to lead her down a path away from the Adamses, and to some degree, I would say, away from most of the victorious patriots. So as often is the case, there's a winning side and a losing side. Then a few years after you go forward, the winning side, which is victorious, splits into parts, right? So there's a sense in which we fought the revolution, we won, we all had the same ideas, no king, get rid of England, all that kind of stuff. But the moment the dust settles, in some senses before the dust settles, now you have to get into definitions. When you say you want equal liberty, well, what exactly do you mean? And then as you might imagine, you might have been in settings, You ever have a relational issue? One of the first things you can do is stop arguing, back up and say, we're using these words. What do these words mean? Let's get to some sort of common definition, and then we can go back into our discussion about the point we're trying to get to. By 77, she's frustrated with where the government is. She and James both, her husband, felt that there was some sort of sense of him not getting a fair shake, him not getting paid the way he should have paid. Many of the people who participated in the revolution, as you probably know, as they say in the Declaration, did give up their economic sense. They did give up their liberties. They did spend their hard-earned money. And, of course, they would have preferred to have gotten paid back. They'd preferred to have gotten the money back, but they often didn't. And some died penniless. They're not the only ones. And so for Mercy, she's beginning to get a little frustrated that her husband's not getting due proper honor, nor getting due proper payback for the investment that he's done. So she starts saying to him, I want you to kind of pull away. Now what that means is there's a moment where you could look at James, because of the friendship between him and John, and her and John, that James Otis could have been one of our presidents. James Otis could have been one of our vice presidents. He could have gone further into national leadership in the Washingtonian administration because of John Adams. John could have pulled him along. He was highly respected. A lot of people liked him. Again, everybody liked Mercy. But because she's getting frustrated with where she perceives things happening to her and to him, she pulls him back. And then he wants to honor her, and he does. He does participate in some things in and around the Boston area, but he misses his chance. There's several letters from John to him saying, dude, you're missing the boat here. This is a great opportunity. He's not the only one who backs down at different times. And then you have people like John Hancock, who, having won, will turn back. The House of Hancock, you can say, was basically the leading, richest trading family in New England, and certainly in Boston. And even though earlier I showed you, in deference to his girlfriend, he decided to dress down, John never lost his love of luxury, and his high taste, and his wanting to spend money. And so as the war is coming to an end, and we're going to win, he goes back to being an effective businessman and trader and living the high life. Now put that in context with somebody like Mercy Otis Warren, who feels like her husband's getting financially screwed and cheated on and taken advantage of, and she's seeing somebody like Hancock live into the luxury. People like Mercy begin to associate, go back to the homespun conversation we had earlier, begin to associate, if you're not wearing homespun, if you're not working to build your own things like Abigail Adams learning how to make saltpeter on her own, or learning how to do certain, then you're somehow no longer in alignment with equal liberty and the principles thereof. You somehow had betrayed us and now are embracing, in the luxuries you're living, almost a British mindset. Now, when you step all the way back, this will be the argument Jefferson's going to make against Hamilton, which we won't get into today. We will next month. It's understandable the contention. It's also understandable that a people that have lived their entire lives as happy British citizens, enjoying the foods and items and things that came from trading with ourselves, right? Having a short little window of like bad, non-importation. The moment that's over, going, yes, I'm so glad to have tea again. I want to wear ribbons again. Remember the comment about the women not wearing ribbons, right? But for people like Mercy Otis Warren and Jefferson, you get this idea of that you can't do that. That's bad. So this really is the part where she starts departing, and the tone of that starts to really begin to show up. And you can see, for instance, she was beginning to feel like something's gotten lost. This will also be Jefferson. And she's no friend of Jefferson's necessarily, just so you understand. I'm raising Jefferson only to say that she's not alone in her wonderings. Is like, did everything we fought for get left behind? Did people like Hancock, who survived and succeeded, have they basically become the very thing that we were fighting against? And to some degree, she'll go to her death saying, yeah, that's exactly what happened. These people betrayed us. They're terrible people. Hamilton's horrible. Washington was bad. They've all, made down during this journey. She actually even begins, as she's writing and protecting, it begins to feel like the Adamses have departed. She and Abigail have their own split in the process. So she starts to write about this. This is important for you to understand why Mercy's so vital in the story. When Shays' rebellions happen. So Shays' rebellion, 87. So 3 years after the signing of the treaty, but really 6 years after the war had been won at Yorktown. Shays' Rebellion is basically the American Revolution redo. It's the exact same argument. You people over there far from us are putting taxes on us that we don't want, and we don't feel like we have adequate representation, and you're impinging and limiting our liberty. So we're going to rebel. And when Shays and the group does it, Hancock's the governor, and he sends an order to the general to go and kill, slay, and destroy if necessary. The same Hancock who wanted to get on, the boats and do the things with the Sons of Liberty. In other words, the hypocrisy of Hancock was very clear. Well, the Warrens are on the sides of the Shays. They're like, that's right. And James in particular goes out and defends them. When that's put down, as it was, and then leads into the Constitution, there's a sense in which Shays, although he's not really principally the main person, but the whole energy behind Shays was itself a betrayal. So now you have two visions, right? On the one hand, you've got people like the Otises, or the Warrens, who are saying, look, Shays is right, you guys have lost your way. And then over here, people who put Shays down is saying, that's just rebellion and anarchy, and we won and fought for a free society. You shouldn't be mad. Which, by the way, back up to 1773 is exactly what the British were saying to the Americans. It's redoing the process. So this leads her to feel very, very frustrated. So when the new Constitution is written, and I've explained this before, but don't fall prey to the lie that the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was in any way bad, wrong, or stupid. It was precisely as they wrote it, so that governance lay mostly with the people, principled by being geographically close to the center of power, which would be in the state capital. But Madison and Adams would agree with this, is principally correct to say, if you do that, you probably can't maintain a single entity nation. So which do you want? So they move, as you know, in the writing of the Constitution, towards Hobbes, to a more powerful centralized government, not as far as we've gone since World War II, but still they move in that direction. And so Mercy's in the anti-federalist group who are like, this is terrible. And you can see when she writes this, she wrote more than this, this is my favorite quotes from her, is that the men, which would have included George Washington, who was in the room, Ben Franklin, Madison, as taking so bold a step as the annihilation of the independence and sovereignty of what? The 13 distinct states. Remember also, I've told you, for some who have not been before, we think of state as a small, discrete part of a larger whole. That is not the way to think of it. A state is a synonym for kingdom, nation, empire, for the civic entity that exists in sovereignty to itself. So they're looking to create 13, we would use the term nations, that they have a relationship with each other. That's what they're arguing about. It's a different discussion whether they're right or not, but that's what they're arguing. So she's saying, you're trying to destroy the freedom and sovereignty of 13 nations to do something else. But that's not what we fought for, Mercy argues. All right, does that make sense for everybody? It's really important. So again, you get this kind of sense of not vitriol, but she's really leaning in now. She's really frustrated. She feels aggrieved about what's happened to her husband, and she doesn't like the direction things are going on. Then, when the Washington and Adams presidencies come up, which she thought all were terrible, it's a terrible 11 years. Like, this is a terrible thing. She blames the Adamses for having betrayed everything. So remember, John is in Europe for most of the 1780s. Abigail goes over in 84 and spends 5 years with him before they come back in 89 after the election, and he's chosen as the vice president, right? When they come back, they go see the Warrens, and it's chilly in the air. There's a sense of like, who are you now? I've gotten some of your letters, and you seem different. There's a whole other conversation which we'll lean a little bit to relative to Abigail and John, but keeping the focus on Mercy, she's thinking, you guys have changed, which, to her credit, they have changed. They would have naturally changed having lived in Paris and London for almost a decade. So this is when she decides, I'm going for it. And so she's going to write our first history. And so it first happens starting in 75. She mentions it to Abigail. Abigail and John, along with her husband and others, begin writing and sending her stuff. when the army's up there surrounding Boston in the siege, Washington often met in her house, so she had firsthand accounts of things that happened in his war councils that she would have listened to. She was friendly, and her husband was friendly with various people. In 81, news of the war became public. Oh, Mrs. Warren has got this history. So people are like, oh, I'm interested. What's up? What's going on with that? She doesn't write it at the time. She's got a lot of other things she's focused on. But finally in 1804, so it's interesting we have to kind of make this point that you're dealing with 1781 and then 1804 when she's actually going to get it published. Because what's happened in the process is, kind of this. There's been this battle, the first of many. We're in one now. This first of many battles over what does it mean to live in a republic? What do we mean when we say government of the people? And where should the locus of power lie? Should it lie in D.C.? Should it lie in Tallahassee? Should it lie right here in Winter Park? But the most power for our lives should be at the local level. Should we be with Rousseau and be anarchist of a point to where the only person who has locus of authority is myself? Where do you want as the citizens in this place to be? And so she has this ongoing struggle that I've already kind of walked through for you in the process. When it comes out, it was both celebrated and denigrated. And so when it comes out and the Adamses read it, they recognize that her take on, again, as I said, the Washington and Adams administration was quite dismal. She was very unhappy with the things that had gone on in the process. So they don't like it. And ultimately, this will lead to a short break in their friendship between 1805 and 1812. Eventually, 7 years later, she and Abigail will send their first letters to each other, and they'll have a little reunion before Mercy dies in the process. The Smith sisters. Abigail had two sisters. They were all three brilliant girls. They were very successful. They were part of the Quincy family, which is arguably the most important family in all of New England. And they were raised to be intelligent, to be witty, to be contributing. Their letters to each other was through their entire lives. They maintained their friendship through their entire lives. They were deeply connected with each other through their entire lives. Even if they sometimes fought and argued with each other, they never lost their friendship with one another. And you can see that their grandmother was Elizabeth Quincy, who married Reverend William Smith and Weymouth. So if you know where Boston is on the map, Braintree is down the road, just a little hop. If you come down the road, that's where the Adams historical stuff is there. Weymouth is just on down the road. It's not down near Plymouth, but it's down the road a little bit further. That's where he was the pastor. Abigail spent much of her formative years with her grandmother, and Elizabeth Quincy really helped shape her mind and her life in the process. Mary and Betsy do not achieve the fame that Abigail achieves, but they each have very successful lives, very involved in the Revolutionary period, both live well. Eventually, Betsy, who will then soon be called Elizabeth, because she wanted to be a little more serious after she married Reverend Shaw, they moved to New Hampshire, to Haverhill, New Hampshire on the Merrimack. Abigail's the one we know. All three girls were considered quite lovely to look at, but they were also quite brilliant in their minds in the process. Through Richard Cranch, who was the man who marries the older sister, John Adams came to meet the Smith sisters. Initially wasn't all that taken with them. He had his eyes on another girl, but then she blew him off because he definitely was not any catch necessarily. He was from a relatively poor family. And he began to recognize how brilliant Abigail was. And as I said to you earlier, for John, the meeting of the minds was the most important. Obviously, Abigail is a quite lovely young lady, and so he wasn't blind to that fact in the process. You can see that her parents did not really approve. They kind of always thought it was a bad idea. So it's pretty rough when the father-in-law is the one doing the ceremony. And with his daughter, he had a quite lovely verse that with his first daughter, quite lovely verse that he had from the Bible. With John, he pulls one out. This is Jesus talking about John the Baptist, but he pulls this out, and literally, John came and they say he hath the devil. And so that literally was part of the sermon that he gave at the wedding. Can you imagine how that might go over at your wedding if the person does that kind of thing? They had their first two children, Abigail and then John Quincy, in the process. Because of John's opportunities in diving into the kind of political world that goes around, Abigail will be a first-person participant, but much of the time in isolation. So for about half, or probably 40% of their wedding life, their married life together, she's on her own because of all his involvement in the things that she did. Because of the work that he did, Financially, they were always in trouble. They were always struggling. This was kind of an aspect that would put them also at odds with, say, the Hancocks or with Jefferson, who basically just spent money he didn't have so he could have a luxurious lifestyle. The Adams believed they should live frugally, live within their limits, and would sacrifice if necessary. And that goes back to when they were first married, and they had these opportunities where he would lose work because he was serving, or he would lose work because he was taking postures that other citizens didn't agree with in their process. He always looked to her as his number one. When he does become the president, you could arguably say he had a cabinet of one, Abigail, that he leaned to her consistently, always looking to her for her advice. So that's going to be important when we come back to this thing of remember the ladies, which we're about to get to in closing things down. He knew that she could manage things. He knew she was quite brilliant. He knew she could educate the children. He knew she was educated and intelligent, so he could do this successfully in the process. When he was appointed representative for House, this is before the revolutionary moments, he's saying, I want your help. And she's like, I got you. She said, we're going to go through this together. What a great thing, right, for a married couple, right, that we will share in all that is to come, right? So that's kind of a cool process there. When he's selected, she notes that this is exciting but nerve-wracking, right? The great anxiety I feel for my country, for you and for our family, renders the day tedious and the night unpleasant. When the battle came to Boston, she basically had her house as a refugee place. Her sister comes and lives because their house basically was untenable. Other people came, so constantly having an open house to take care of people. She lost their daughter, Susanna. She didn't lose it, but Susanna died. So she has the 4 children that she's raising in the process. She is awakened by battle, both at Bunker Hill, but before Bunker Hill, there's a moment where the British Army is looking either for foraging or they're trying to figure out a way to break out of the besiegement that's around Boston. So troops landed at Weymouth, where her parents had been, where he had been in the church. The militia saves the day, but so she's really kind of getting a first-hand touch of what battle's like. You can see she writes to John, I think I'm very brave upon the whole. She was able to see from a distance what was going on with Bunker Hill. She couldn't go close, did not try to ride close to the battle in the process. She ultimately will begin to do everything like other women would have done, looking for things that they had in their house that were pewter, that could be melted to form into bullets, because again, there was not a lot of military supplies for the Revolutionary Army in the process. And then you could arguably say, so I've said it here before, John Adams is considered by his peers the Atlas of Independence. He's the one consistently, when the Second Continental Congress starts in May of '75, pushing for independence. That's a move for him. If you go back in the story, he's more of this kind of moderate rebel. He's there, but he's not all the way where his cousin Sam is, who's a firebrand, let's burn the place down kind of a thing, right? He's the Atlas of Independence. You could say then, he's only the Atlas of Independence, or he's able to be the Atlas of Independence because of Abigail. Abigail is consistently writing and pushing and prodding, demanding to know, why haven't we done this? Why haven't we done this? He's responding back to her. He's trying to answer for her. When the Declaration is written in July, he handwrites a copy to her to send her a copy, which she gets. And 4 days later, she was in Boston and she heard it read aloud. So she tells him about how she heard it. She went to King Street in Boston. It was being read. Great attention was given to every word. And as soon as it ended, the cry was, God save our American states. And then she noted that after the dinner, all throughout the town, any vestiges of the royal family of George III were taken down and burned in a great bonfire. And she said, thus endeth royal authority in this state. And all the people say, amen. So she's very excited about the process. She ultimately will go with him and again serve in essence as First Lady. John was the first ambassador to England. Abigail is the first lady of the ambassadorship to England. He's the first vice president. She's the first lady of the vice presidency. He's the second president, which makes him the first next president. We talk about the challenges that leads to for John. She's the first next first lady in the story, carrying a heavy burden. And there's more to examine on their lives, which we don't have time for today. I do think it's interesting to know because John and George Washington were never close. They weren't enemies, and George will support him in '96, mostly because by that point George hates Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson's a scoundrel and a liar. Abigail and Martha become close. And they become close as they're both navigating through this world in which we're now building this new country, and how do we design things and how we make it work. And it's a sweet kind of idea of thinking of these two first ladies kind of navigating this together, a woman from Virginia, very, very wealthy, a woman from a very distinguished family in New England, but not wealthy, kind of navigating together, working their way through what it means to serve. Everybody talks about, and George says, I'm walking on untrodden ground. And then again, as I said, John is the first next president. Nobody's done that before. What does it mean? These two ladies are carrying the same burden of kind of leading their country. What should we expect from the first lady? And how do they do it? How do they spend the money? When they became the vice president, they were underpaid. There had been an idea of how much the presidency got $25,000. The vice president only got $5,000. They had assumed or been told the vice president would have more than that. So again, they tried to make it work, and they successfully, lived their lives through the moves as they kind of went along in the process. Which then leads us to this. All right. So we're talking about the women of the revolution, the focus of women, and this again is this most famous of statements by Abigail about what it means for women in the revolution. I know we're we're going to press through it. Just stay with me, right? So she notes to him, look, you guys are going to write a code of laws, I assume, which they were. They're going to start in July of 76. And so I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Here's the key sentence. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of their husbands. And then she goes on and talks about how, look, if you don't listen to us, we're going to foam in rebellion. Well, what does she mean by all that? It's the debate that lots of historians have kind of wrestled with. Here you can see what Birkin and two others say about it. And basically, she was not remotely asking about the vote, but she was asking for marriage laws to be kind of rewritten and protected, to restate it, that would allow for a liberty and a dignity to the women. But however you look at it, it's still an overly strong, not overly strong, a strong and obvious for us statement that she's writing. Now, when you know John and Abigail's relationship, it does raise kinds of questions, right? How serious are they being with each other? Because if you read their letters, and I've read many of them, there's volumes of these, there's a loving playfulness between them. There's a deep relationship between them. And because you don't have the context of tone, you just have the letter, you get emails to this day. Sometimes you have to, what's the context here? Particularly if the tone doesn't feel right to you. And this is in her series of letters where she's saying, declare independence. And then she'd fuss at him, like, why have you written more letters? I've written 5, you've not gotten yours. And there's times he's like, I wrote you on this date and this date and this date. What are you talking about? Having this back and forth kind of a thing. So what's going on? His response is typically perceived by historians as quite dismissive. I don't think that's fair to John. Now, I'll show you in a second. He misses her tone. But nonetheless, he's trying to respond to her. She says it's saucy. I love that word. She's like, it's a saucy answer. She writes to Mercy, trying to get Mercy involved in this whole process. I think it's fair to say that there is a jesting tone in what he says. The question is he jesting in dismissiveness, or is he jesting in flirtatiousness? Is he trying to say, you're my beloved, I get it, you're asking me this question? I do think it's fair to say he misses the tone, because she wasn't jesting. She was honestly writing. And in a sense, you can hear her saying, you're an amazing husband. I never have to worry about any of your treatment to me. However, I know some ladies, and they're getting crappy treatment, and there's no judicial or legal protection for them in any capacity. And you should try to write a code of laws that opens up a situation that would give equal status like I have with you in the process. So you can see he's writing back, and he's kind of got this, I feel like it's a love tap kind of thing, but some of you I've been here where I totally missed the tone of what my wife is saying. She's done the same thing. She's not with me. But then that's that communication gap that if you love each other, you're going to try to listen to each other and say, wait, did I miss something? And try to back up and fix it. But she is frustrated, and she says so quite openly in her letter to Mercy. And she says, I thought the most generous plan was to put it out of the power of the arbitrary and tyrannical, meaning men, husbands, to injure us with impunity by establishing some laws in our favor upon just and liberal principles. And she's asking Mercy to write John also. You should write him also and tell him this kind of stuff. And then I love this part. So as you can see, she's a little frustrated. I have been making trial of the disinterestedness of his virtue, and when weighed in the balance, have found it wanting. So she's laying it out there. We don't know. There's no further letters or communication between them to it. I will say this, and not trying to overly defend John, but just to say I think the jesting, maybe even flirtatious jesting, is a piece of it. Two loving people talking, but one missing the other. Is that, as I said to you already, she was always his number one confidant. He turned to her consistently all the time. In every decision you think about John Adams, you have to always say, he made that with Abigail's point of view. So if you don't like it, she was involved in it. She's thinking it's a good idea also. And so that idea, there's no sense in him saying, you silly woman, go sit in a corner and make some clothing or something. That's not how he treated her. That's kind of not how I thought. And it is their relationship that I want to leave you with, because it does kind of echo the vision that became known as this kind of Republican motherhood kind of thing. And it's where Heather really wanted us to end with. And I know we're late, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this to you. This is how she would have closed out the talk with you. And as it is often with Heather, it's lovely. So I'm just going to leave you with this, and then we'll be done. Women's participation mattered. They shaped political culture, sustained economies, supported armies, resisted oppression, and negotiated survival in extraordinary circumstances. Their actions influenced how the revolution unfolded and how its ideals were understood and lived. By restoring women to the story of the American Revolution, we move beyond a narrow narrative of the founding fathers and battlefield victories. We see the revolution as a collective, contested process, one that unfolded in kitchens, in sewing circles, in camps, as much as in congresses and courts. Understanding these women's experiences does not just add new characters to an old story. Rather, it fundamentally changes the story itself, reminding us on America's 250th birthday that the struggle for independence was also a struggle over who counted, whose labor mattered, and what liberty truly meant then, and what it continues to mean today. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you so much. Normally, I would take questions from the audience. We are late, and because the library always has things going on, I will stick around as I often do. Hope you have a lovely day. If you are a mother, or you all have a mother, hopefully if she's alive, love on your mother for Mother's Day. And if you're a mother, thank you for you, and celebrate your Mother's Day. Have a good rest of your weekend.